play the game of chess, first, set up the game. To do this, first set out the game board somewhere between both players. Each player will sit on one end of the board. The board should be oriented so that the side of the board facing each player has the white square on the right corner of the board. Next, each player will decide which color they would like to play the game with. Each player will collect all 16 of their pieces in their chosen color. After collecting their pieces, each player will place their pieces on specific squares on the game board. The first pieces players will place on the board are their pawns. Each player will place their 8 pawns on each of the 8 spaces of the second row of their side of the game board. The next pieces they will place are their 2 rooks. These pieces typically look like small castles. Each player will place their 2 rooks on the corners on their side of the game board, behind their row of pawns. Next, each player will locate their 2 knights. The knight pieces typically look like a horse. Each player will place one of their knights next to each of their rook pieces on the back row of their playing area. Next, they will locate their 2 bishops. Each player will place their bishops next to their knight pieces on the back row. The last 2 pieces that will be placed on the board are the king and the queen. The king piece is typically taller than the queen piece. Each player will place their queen piece on the remaining space of the back row that matches the shade of that player's piece. So the dark-colored queen piece will go on the remaining dark-colored square, and the light-colored piece will go on the remaining light-colored space. There is a trick players can remember for the placement of the queen. Players can remember that the queen likes to be on the square that matches her outfit. So the dark-colored queen piece will want to be started on the dark square, and the light-colored queen piece will want to be placed on the light square. The king is the last piece that will be placed. Each player will place their king on the final remaining square of the back row. If the back row was set up correctly, each player's side will be a mirror image of the other side. After the game has been set up, players are ready to begin playing the game. The game of chess is a 2-player board game that is easy to learn but can be difficult to master. Both players will take turns moving one of their pieces on the game board. Each piece moves in a specific way. The ultimate goal for each player is to be the first to capture the other player's king piece. To start the game, the player playing as the lighter colored piece will always go first. On their first turn, they will choose one of their pieces to move on the game board. Each type of piece in the game of chess moves in a specific way. Let's look at each of the pieces of the game. The smallest and most prolific pieces in the game are the pawns. These pieces also have the smallest range of moves that they are able to make. Pawns will always only move in a forward direction, towards the opponent's pieces. They may never move backward or from side to side. On a pawn's first move, each pawn is able to move either 1 space forward, or it may move 2 spaces forward. After that pawn moves on its first turn, it may only move 1 space forward at a time. Moving 2 spaces is only allowed on each pawn's first move. So if this player wanted to move this pawn, they would only be able to move it 1 space forward, because it already moved from the space it started. On another turn, let's say they wanted to move this pawn. Because the pawn is still on its starting square and has not yet been moved, this player can choose to move it either 1 space forward or to move it 2 spaces forward. Pawns do have other special moving capabilities when they are capturing other pieces, but this will be explained later. The next type of piece is the rook. Each player has 2 rooks. Rooks will always move forward, backward, left, or right of the square they are currently sitting, but never diagonal. Rooks can move as many spaces as the player chooses, in one of these directions per turn. Rooks, however, cannot jump over other pieces, so a player would have to move other pieces to free the rook to move. On this player's next turn, if they chose to move their rook, they could move in one of their allowed directions that is not blocked. Knights must always move in an L shape, covering 3 spaces. To move a knight, a player will either move it 2 spaces forward or backward, then turn and move an additional 1 space to the right or to the left. Or they will move 1 space forward or backward, turn and move an additional 2 spaces to the right or to the left to create an L. If a knight is moved in a legal way, it will always end on a square of the opposite color of the square it started. So if it started on a dark colored square, it will end on a light one. The knight is also the only piece in the game that can jump over other pieces, so the knight can be moved on a player's first turn, if they choose. The knight can jump over both their pieces and their opponent's pieces to reach a new square. But they may not move if the space they plan to move is occupied by one of their other pieces. So this knight would currently be blocked from moving until they move one of their pawns. A knight's move must always cover exactly 3 spaces, so a player could not make a partial move of 1 or 2 spaces. The knight must always move in an L shape as described. The bishop piece always moves in a diagonal direction. They may move both forward and backward as long as the spaces are connected in a single diagonal direction. Each player will have 1 bishop that always travels along the dark-colored diagonal boxes, and another bishop that always travels along the light diagonal boxes. Bishops can move as many spaces as a player chooses, in one of these directions per turn. Bishops, however, cannot jump over other pieces. So if this player wanted to move their bishop, they would have to move their pawn to free it to move. If they chose to move their bishop again on another turn, they could move it in any one open diagonal direction. The queen is the piece in the game with the most powerful movement ability. The queen has the movement abilities of both the rook and the bishop combined. So the queen can move forward or backward, left or right, or diagonally. If a player chooses to move their queen on their turn, they may move it many spaces in one of those directions. Just like the rook and the bishop, the queen may not jump over other pieces. So if this player wanted to move their queen, they could move their pawn on one turn, and then move their queen on the next turn. On the turn after that, if they wanted to move their queen again, they could move it in any direction that is not blocked by their other pieces. The final piece in the game is the king. The queen has the most powerful movement ability in the game, but the king is the most valuable piece in the game. If your opponent captures your king, you will lose the game. The king has a movement ability that is a mix of the queen's movement and the pawn's movement. The king may move in any direction, forward, backward, left, right, or diagonally, like the queen. But the king may only move 1 space at a time, like the pawn typically can. The king is blocked at the beginning of the game, so if this player wanted to move their king, they would have to move their pawn out of the way first. There is one special move that can be completed between the king and a rook. This is known as castling. To explain castling, first we'll look at how it works, and then we'll break down the actual rules of castling. Castling is a move where the king moves 2 spaces towards the rook, and then the rook jumps over the king to end on the space next to the king. The king may complete this move exactly 1 time in the game, and they may do it with either one of their rooks. Now that we've looked at the basics of castling, let's break down the rules. All spaces between the king and the 1 rook piece the player wants to castle with must be empty. Neither the king nor the rook can jump over other pieces, so there must be a clear path between them to be able to castle. To castle, that player's king and the rook they plan to castle with must not have moved from their original starting position on the game board. So if this player moved their king, they could no longer castle, even if they moved it back on another turn. If this player had not moved their king yet, but they moved their rook, they would no longer be able to castle using the king and that rook, even if they moved that rook back to the place it started. They would, however, still be able to use the other rook to castle, if they cleared a path to do so by moving the other pieces out of the way. The king may not be in check when they try to castle. The idea of check will be explained later, but it basically means that your opponent has at least one piece that could capture your king on their next move. For example, this king could not castle because their opponent's rook has an open path to take the king on their next move. Castling is a move a player has as an option to protect their king from future attack, not a way they can escape an imminent attack. Along with not being able to castle if the king is in check, the king may also not pass through a square to castle that will put it in check. For example, this player would not be able to castle their king with this rook because while moving the two spaces over, they would pass through a square and this player's knight would put it in check as it passed through. The king is never allowed to move to or through a space that puts it in danger. In this example, the king could still move in the other direction and castle with the other rook, assuming that rook has not yet moved from its starting position, because it is neither currently in check nor will it move through a space that puts it in check. As long as all of the previous rules are followed, the king may castle exactly once during the game, either moving the king 2 spaces to the right and jumping the rook over the king, or 2 spaces to the left and jumping the rook over the king. Every piece in the game is able to capture every other piece, so even the low-ranked pawns can capture other pieces. To capture a piece, a player must end their move on a space with one of their opponent's pieces. Each piece, with the exception of the pawn, will capture pieces using their normal movement abilities. Let's look at how each specific piece captures other pieces. Pawns are the only pieces in the game that capture the opponent's pieces in a different way than the way they move. A pawn cannot capture another piece that is directly in front of it. So if these pawns were here, they would currently be blocked from moving. To capture another player's piece, a pawn will move 1 space forward diagonally. So to capture, this player can move their pawn diagonally to the space containing their opponent's pawn. Then they will take their opponent's pawn piece into their player area. Capturing is the only time a player will be able to move their pawn diagonally. So if this pawn wanted to capture this knight, they would move their pawn like this and take that piece. As mentioned, pawns must always be moving forward, so this pawn could not capture this rook, because it would be a backward move. There is a special move that pawns may use to capture another pawn during the game. This is known as en passant. This is a French term that means in passing. To explain this move, first we'll look at it in practice, and then we'll break down the rules of capturing using this method. To capture en passant, a player's opponent will move their pawn up 2 spaces on that pawn's first move of the game. Their pawn will land on a space next to one of their opponent's pawns. Using the normal rules of capturing with a pawn, the light-colored piece could not capture the dark-colored piece. However, using en passant capturing rules, the light player could capture the dark piece. To do this, they will move diagonally in front of that player's piece and capture it. Let's look at one more example. This player moves their pawn for the first time in the game, so they move it up 2 spaces. The other player now decides to capture their opponent's pawn, en passant, so they move their piece diagonally in front of their opponent's piece and capture it. Now that we've looked at 2 examples, let's break down the rules of capturing in this way. The first thing that must be known about capturing en passant is that this move only ever occurs between 2 pawn pieces. So a pawn could not capture any other piece using this method, and no other piece in the game can use this method to capture another piece. It is only for one pawn to capture another pawn on the game board. The only pawns that are allowed to be captured en passant are pawns that are making their first move on the game, and there will only ever be a pawn that chooses to move 2 spaces on their first turn. The player capturing using this method has exactly 1 turn after their opponent's pawn moves next to them to capture that pawn. If they don't take the opportunity when it presents itself, they are not allowed to take it. So let's say this player had moved their pawn on their first move up 2 spaces next to this player. That player would be able to capture that pawn en passant on their next turn. If that player decided to move a different piece on their next turn, they would have sacrificed their ability to take that pawn. The pawn would now be safe, and no longer able to be captured en passant. However, if this player moved their pawn forward 2 spaces on that pawn's first move of the game, this player could, on their next turn, choose to capture that pawn. As mentioned, the other pieces in the game capture using their normal movement rules. To capture another piece, they will simply move to the space containing one of their opponent's pieces. They may never capture one of their own pieces. So a rook would capture a piece by moving forward, backward, left, or right, and ending on a square with one of their opponent's pieces to capture it. A bishop would move diagonally and end on a square with any one of their opponent's pieces to capture it. A knight would move in an L shape and end on a square with any one of their opponent's pieces to capture it. A queen would move in any one direction to end on a square with their opponent's piece. And a king would move 1 space in any direction to capture their opponent's piece. Anytime a player captures any other player's piece, they will place the captured piece in their player area. A player is only allowed to capture 1 piece per turn. Pawns may seem like a useless piece in the game, but pawns do have a special ability that can make them quite useful to keep around. If a player is able to move their pawn piece all the way across the game board and reach the last row of their opponent's side, that player will immediately promote that pawn to a different piece of their choice. The pawn can become a queen, a rook, a knight, or a bishop. The most common thing players will change their pawn to is a queen. This is because the queen is the most powerful piece in the game. If the player's queen was captured by their opponent, that player will simply trade their pawn piece for the captured queen and place the queen piece where the pawn piece was on their opponent's side. A player is allowed to promote a pawn to a queen even if they still have their queen on the game board. If this happens and players do not have extra queen pieces available, if that player's rook piece was captured, they can turn the rook upside down, and that can be used to represent the queen. If the player still has both of their rooks and their queen still on the game board, they will have to figure out a different way to represent their piece as a queen, such as a coin or some stand-in object. If a player is able to promote multiple pawns during the game, they can have multiple queens on the game board. Most players will choose to promote their pawns to a queen, because it is the most powerful piece in the game, but it can be strategic to promote a pawn to a different piece in the game. If a player chooses to promote their pawn to a rook, a knight, or a bishop, this is known as underpromoting. If a player chooses to do this, and their opponent has captured one of their pieces of this type, that player will simply swap their pawn for that piece. So if this player wanted to promote their pawn to a bishop, they would simply swap it for the bishop their opponent captured. If they do not have any of the pieces they wish to promote their pawn to available, they will figure out a different way to indicate which piece it is. So if this player promoted their pawn and wanted to make it a knight, they could use a coin to represent the knight and have 3 knights on the game board. As the game plays out, players will each try to capture the other player's king. If a player moves their piece to a new square and will be able to capture the king on their next turn, that player has just put the king in check. That player must alert their opponent of this fact by saying check. On their next turn, their opponent must remove the danger from their king. To do this, they can either move their king to a new square to move it out of danger, move a piece in front of the king to block the danger, or they may capture the piece to remove the danger. While moving, it is illegal for a player to move their king into a square that puts their king into check. Their opponent's queen could attack them from the square, so this move would be illegal. It is also illegal for a player to move another piece and put the king in check, so this player could not move their bishop to try to take their opponent's knight, because moving their bishop would expose their king to their opponent's queen. This would put their king in check. Any move that would put the king into check is an illegal move. If a player makes one of these moves accidentally, they will have to put the piece back where it started and move in a different way. The ultimate goal of the game is to get your opponent into what is known as checkmate. When a player gets their opponent into checkmate, their opponent's king is trapped, and they officially win the game. So if this player moved their rook here, they would put their other player's king in checkmate. Because if their opponent moved their king here, the player's bishop and their rook would put their king in check. If they moved here, the player's queen and their bishop would put their king in check. And if they moved here, this player's queen and their rook would put their king in check. This pawn is blocked from moving, so it could not help out the king. And this pawn could move, but if it did, the king would still be in check from the rook. This player has nowhere to move without their king being captured by the other player. So this player would say checkmate and officially win the game. The king is never allowed to move to a square on the game board that will put it in check. Because of this fact, there is a possibility that the game can end in a draw, which in chess is known as a stalemate. For example, in this situation, the king is not currently in check because none of their players' pieces could currently capture it. However, if this king had to move on their turn, they would not have any legal moves. The king is never allowed to move into a space that will put it in check. If they moved here, the queen would put them in check. If they moved here, both the queen and the rook would put them in check. If they moved here, the rook would have them in check. Here, the rook and the queen would put them in check. And here, the bishop would put them in check. This player has no legal move, so this game would end in a stalemate, and there would be no winner. To get the hang of the game of chess, it can be helpful to practice by playing online games or games against a computer.